So, a major focus of our next lecture will be on the beginnings of European colonialism in the New World, in the Americas. And this begins with Christopher Columbus and the encounter. We already talked about some of the early European explorers, their encounter with the New World. Initially, they weren't entirely aware of the fact that it was, in fact, new continents. We often refer to this period as the first phase of colonialism because things are going to really radically change when we get into the 19th century. But right now, we're really focusing on this first phase, which means also that we're focusing on the Spanish and Portuguese, who for most of this period will be at the forefront of European imperialism and colonialism as indicated on this map, highlighted in red, indicating areas that are going to be brought under Spanish control, not just in the New World, also in the Pacific, in the Philippines, and then, of course, in purple corresponding to the Portuguese empires. And you'll see that they're also very active, not just in South America, roughly in the territory corresponding to modern-day Brazil, but also along the coast of Africa and in a few places in India as well. So again, the first phase of colonialism, sometimes referred to as the Age of Discovery, clearly representing a European perspective, initiated by Christopher Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of America. And during this phase, definitely Spain and Portugal will be the dominant European powers. And you might recall that initially both of them were motivated by a desire to discover new sea routes to India and the Far East. And in fact, Christopher Columbus initially thought that he had made it to the Indies, hence why he referred to the indigenous people he encountered as Indians, a term that unfortunately stuck, where even now we're only really coming to terms with that kind of terminology. And so, first of all, they didn't realize that they had encountered a new landmass, and then it would take some time before they understood the full extent of it, right? How large it was, but eventually establishing vast empires in much of present-day South and Latin America. Now, some of you might be wondering why pretty much the entirety of South America, apart from Brazil, ended up speaking Spanish, and Brazil ended up speaking Portuguese. And a lot of that had to do with that at a pretty early point in an effort to avoid conflict between Spain and Portugal. They had kind of deferred to the decision of the Pope on how to divide up the territories, and they basically drew a line kind of, north to south through the territory, or at least what they knew of it until that point. And this became the basis for the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything to the west of that line would go to Spain. Everything to the east would go to Portugal. And, again, they didn't realize that, in fact, the vast majority of this new landmass was to the west of that line. From the Pope's point of view, it was primarily about who would be saving souls where, right? Converting the indigenous population to Catholicism. Now, both the Spanish and Portuguese initially, as far as the exploitation of these new territories, focus on gold and silver, looking for precious metals. So they very early on established large numbers of gold and in particular silver mines, though eventually they would start also appropriating agricultural lands, and you would see the arrival of some settlers. Now, by the way, with the Spanish and Portuguese, you're never going to see as kind of large scale a migration of Europeans as you're going to see in North America with the English. So a bit more limited, but there will be new settlers, mostly coming from Spain and Portugal, who are going to settle and establish huge plantations on these new lands. Now, for both the Spanish and the Portuguese, right, kind of the operative economic system at this time was something called mercantilism. Not just with them, right, but this is going to define how they kind of view these new territories and how best to exploit them. Right, so European empires are based primarily on commerce, and the mercantilism, kind of the defining kind of basic foundational idea is that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world, right? And so is kind of a zero-sum game, right? You need to acquire as much of that limited wealth as you possibly can. The more anyone else gets, the less there is for you. This is actually quite different than how we view things in capitalism, where there's kind of a more kind of a win-win perspective, right? Like that, there really is no ceiling on economic wealth, right? You can always generate more wealth, and in fact, the best way to do this is to have as kind of much free economic interaction between different parties as possible, right? But very different from mercantilism. Some would argue that actually under the current administration of the United States, we've kind of returned to a kind of mercantilist point of view. But in any event, right, that was kind of the predominant view at the time. So that also meant that governments were going to be heavily involved in the economy, trying to make sure, to direct as much of that wealth to their respective country as possible, right? So there was kind of a belief that each nation had to gain a favorable trade balance, very often defined in terms of how much gold and silver you had. So, this is where the gold and silver mines come in, right? Kind of the idea that we're literally, discovering this wealth until now Europeans unaware of, and we need to ensure that as much of that gold and silver is directed to either Spain or Portugal or whichever country we're talking about, right? So and this really was about the home country, not about the economic situation in the New World, but rather the economic well-being of either Spain or Portugal. That took precedence, right? So limited amount of wealth, we need to gather as much of it as we can and then direct it back to the home country, meaning also that very little of it is going to remain at its point of origin. Another way to think of colonies is that essentially they existed to provide raw materials, so not just gold and silver, but also things like lumber, for instance, and then to provide markets, right? So, the idea, you collect the raw material, you ship it back to, say, Spain. In Spain, it might be manufactured into finished products like furniture, things of that nature, even food products, and then those are sold in the colonies, right? So they provide not just the raw materials, but also the markets. And related to that, connected with this idea of the home country regulating economies, they would also control trade. Colonies were bound to trade exclusively with their respective home country, right? So a Spanish colony was not allowed to trade with other colonies. It was not permitted to trade with other European powers. Now, that was at least how it worked in principle. Many of the colonists, those who settled in these new territories, didn't want to be restricted in that way. They wished to trade with each other or, if possible, even with other Europeans. Sometimes we refer to this period as the golden age of smuggling, right? So a lot of economic interaction that was technically illegal, but in principle, everything was supposed to go through the home country. So, of course, when the Spanish and Portuguese arrived, they encountered many different indigenous civilizations, some of which were quite sophisticated, and probably most notable in this regard would be the Aztecs and Incas. And actually, from this point forward, we're going to be focusing more on the Spanish than the Portuguese. We will come back to them. But eventually the Spanish were able to very quickly and rather handily defeat the Aztecs and Incas and incorporate their lands into this new empire they were creating in the New World. They were able to do this due to a combination of factors. Certainly superior weaponry, but also they proved to be very adept at forming alliances with local tribes, many of whom had poor relations with both the Aztecs and Incas. And then one factor that to some degree was unintentional, they introduced new diseases against which Native Americans had no resistance. Probably most famous in this regard would be smallpox, which according to some estimates wiped out up to 90%, 90% of the Native American population. A lot of this was without intent. It's not as if the Spanish really understood how disease spread and, the role of germs and so forth. But having said that, we don't want to let them entirely off the hook, or any other Europeans that arrived in the New World. For instance, very often they did recognize that if, say, you were to collect the blankets of people who had died from smallpox, and then without first cleaning them, you were to, say, make a gift to them to certain Native American groups, there was a high probability you would end up wiping out quite a few of them. So that kind of thing did happen. But to some extent, the main thing is once it entered the local population, it spread very, very rapidly. Partly again because they had never encountered things like smallpox and so had never developed any resistance. One small modicum of revenge is the New World would transmit to the Old World syphilis. Definitely not pleasant, but to be fair, nowhere near as devastating in Europe. So in telling the story of the Spanish encounters with the Aztecs and the Inca, we might begin with Hernán Cortés, who in 1519 landed in Mexico with roughly 500 men and horses, and very quickly established communications with the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II. Things looking actually pretty promising initially. Montezuma believed that Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, sought to appease him with gifts, so kind of graciously extending Aztec hospitality to the Spanish. But then the Spanish were quick to take advantage of that. So as we mentioned, one technique or one factor that allowed the Spanish to conquer the Aztecs was the forging of alliances with tribes hostile to them, in this case subject tribes, who then together with the Spaniards marched on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, where they took Montezuma prisoner. Now, in that initial encounter, the Aztecs, not surprisingly at that point, they turned on the Spaniards and actually almost wiped them out. But the Spanish were able to regroup, and then in 1521, under the leadership of Cortés, they defeated the Aztecs and razed this beautiful city of Tenochtitlan to the ground. And really, by all accounts, an absolutely magnificent city built on a lake in the crater of a massive volcano. Many have compared it, based on descriptions, to Venice in Italy, many canals and so forth. Just very sophisticated architecture and so on. But now completely destroyed, though eventually providing the foundation for what will become the capital of the Spanish Empire in the New World, Mexico City. In a way, the story with the Incas, not that much different. Again, the Spanish behaving in I think by our modern day sensibilities, might be considered a somewhat devious way. In this case, the main character in this story is Francisco Pizarro, who in 1532 landed on the western coast of South America and then tricked the Inca ruler Atahualpa into attending a conference, under the pretense that they would negotiate some kind of peaceful arrangement. When he showed up, they seized him and eventually had him killed. And from that point on, it was pretty much a story of conflict. The Spaniards fought their way to the Inca capital of Cusco, which they eventually captured. There would be a period of insurrections after that, but by the late 1560s, the Spaniards had established royal control over pretty much all the territory that had been part of the Inca Empire. Now, from that point forward, a big part of the story in terms of how the Spaniards interact with the indigenous people is going to be about the spread of Catholicism. And so you might recall we talked a bit about how Catholicism and various institutions related to the papacy were very powerful in Spain. Right? Spain saw itself as kind of the preeminent Catholic power. A lot of this really reflected genuine conviction that the Catholic faith was the true faith. And so they had kind of a special relationship with the Pope. And in many ways, the Pope will go on, or the papacy will go on to legitimize the Spanish conquest of the New World. The papacy approved of military conquest. They saw this as a means to an end, a means to convert the natives to the Christian faith and to eradicate pagan practices. But we should note that the role of the Catholic Church in the New World will end up being somewhat complicated, right? So in many ways, certainly a conservative force working to protect the political power of the Spanish authorities. And they really didn't interfere too much in how the Spanish monarchy and how, Spanish administrative personnel governed the territories, right? For them, the main thing was about promoting Catholicism. And in this regard, they were certainly very zealous. And it kind of also helps to remember that a lot of this now is going to be happening at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, right? So this becomes kind of one aspect of the Counter-Reformation or Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. Kind of a feeling of, we can make up for all the Catholics we lost in Europe by converting as many people here in the New World. One point that we might make that, in a sense, speaks favorably of the Spanish in this regard, and this might seem like a somewhat backwards compliment, but at least inherent in their desire to convert the indigenous people to Catholicism was a recognition that they were, in fact, fellow human beings, right? So that therefore they had souls and they felt, a kind of genuine obligation to convert them to the true faith so their souls wouldn't be damned after they died. This will be very different than, say, the English attitude in North America, where they really didn't try very hard to convert Native Americans to, in this case, the Protestant faith, but in part because they saw them as effectively subhuman, simply to be, eliminated and got out of the way. Story is going to be a bit different in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, right? Particularly the Spanish colonies, where, very quickly the Catholic Church is going to have a very prominent place. Not just politically, but also with respect to society. Something evident, for instance, in the construction of a massive cathedral in Mexico City. This is the Metropolitan Cathedral, which, when you visit it, and I've had the pleasure of doing so, you really feel a bit more like you're in Europe than in the quote-unquote New World. So for the most part, the Catholic Church cooperating with Spanish authority, in a sense legitimizing it. At the same time, in many ways, particularly as you go down the hierarchy, many members of the Catholic Church, probably the most interactive with the indigenous population, and very often aware of abuses and trying to, to somehow ameliorate them to some degree. Probably the best example of this would be what are known as Mendicant Friars, right? So this is, pretty low in terms of the, kind of structural hierarchy of authority within the Catholic Church. But these were the individuals, kind of in the field at the forefront in efforts to convert Native Americans. Many of them associated with monastic orders like the Franciscan, Dominican, or Jesuit orders. And so, they often had kind of firsthand knowledge of the very often harsh conditions that were being imposed on the native peoples. And, they deplored these and very often would even try to, make other Spaniards aware of how they were being treated, maybe try and persuade those in authority to treat them better. And, probably most notable in this regard was a fellow named Bartolomé de Las Casas, who wrote a great deal about the poor treatment of native peoples, right? So, and this kind of led to, or he provided the foundation for what came to be known as the Black Legend, right? Which, in a sense, it kind of encompassed the perception that Spanish treatment of the native peoples was for the most part, unprincipled and inhumane, probably somewhat exaggerated, right? Like sometimes would be reporting things about children being boiled alive and of that nature that probably didn't happen, but most likely a good deal of what he did report did happen. And certainly, his purpose was to make Spaniards in general kind of aware of what was going on in the hopes that it would create some kind of public pressure to improve the conditions under which the native peoples of the Americas were living. So Bartolomé de Las Casas, he was writing between late 15th, early 16th centuries. He lived between 1474, 1566, was really critical of Spanish practices. And, perhaps this helped to some degree, but for the most part, the treatment of Native Americans would remain very poor and highly exploitative, right? So, from the perspective of Spanish authority, their primary purpose was to work as laborers, whether in plantations and especially in the mines, right? So at the very best, perhaps the church somewhat moderated their treatment, but, we don't want to ignore, the fact that for the most part, it was pretty horrible. In some ways, the mines, and, for the Spanish, probably the chief economic benefit of the New World was silver. I mean, they found gold mines as well, but silver proved to be very, very pervasive. And until the early 17th century, it became the chief source of metallic wealth, right? There was a lot of silver mining going on in the New World, in the territories under Spanish authority. You had, for instance, silver mining centers in Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, and then smaller sites in northern Mexico. And a lot of the wealth derived of mining went directly to the crown, right? So, those engaged, Spaniards engaged in kind of organizing the mining and overseeing it would derive some wealth. Some of it did remain within the New World, but a large amount of it went back to the old one. The Spanish crown itself received 1/5 of all mining revenues, often referred to as the quinto, 1/5. We should know, too, that all of this silver coming into the New World would actually generate a lot of inflation, right? One of the problems with mercantilism is, kind of the idea that, the more material wealth you found, particularly things like, precious metals like silver and gold, other kinds of gems and so forth, like kind of increase your wealth. But from a capitalistic perspective, we generally see wealth is defined by economic activity. So bringing in all this precious metal would have been the equivalent of printing money today, right? Like you print additional dollars or whatever currency you're speaking of. That doesn't actually create more wealth. It just kind of divides whatever wealth you have into smaller units, right? So that each, if it were US dollars, each dollar becomes less in value. In this case, each silver coin that was being manufactured from the silver brought in from the New World actually diminished the value of silver overall. Nonetheless, right, I mean, it would take a while before even more intellectually minded individuals quite understood how this worked, and silver production would be a major economic activity organized by the Spanish crown. And it was highly exploitative and very, very labor intensive. And it was the Native Americans that provided the labor, right? So, and there was very little concern about, the conditions in the mines, that the Native Americans weren't overworked, that they had sufficient time to recover from a hard day's work and so forth. Eventually, this would also be a factor in the import of African slaves, particularly in the Caribbean. Sometimes, very often, this might be to replace Native Americans who are being used in the mine, but in any event, all these things became kind of intertwined. Now, in terms of the utilization of Native American labor, there were a number of institutions in place in order to kind of guarantee that it would be available. One was known as the encomienda, which basically, so if you were someone who had been given a grant by the crown in order to operate a mine, this would give you the right, from the Spanish point of view, the right to the labor of a specified number of Native Americans for a specified length of time. And again, it would have been very exploitative, right? It would have been, very long and arduous hours. Workers had few rights and so forth. And there was kind of the idea of just kind of working people to death. You could always find new Native Americans to replace them. This system would persist until the 18th century in some parts of Latin America. So it would really carry on for quite some time. Eventually, some Native Americans found that they could, kind of avoid this labor by making payments. They could substitute payments in kind for labor. But, it would have been a pretty heavy payment, right, to get out of this. Eventually, the encomienda will be replaced by the repartimiento, which is actually modeled on a labor practice that had been utilized by the Incas known as the mita. So basically, it required that male Native Americans devote a set number of days of labor annually to Spanish economic enterprises. So this was kind of the prevailing system in the mines of Potosi. And, again, as a good example of how exploitative this might be, right? Very often, if you were a Native American, for instance, in Potosi, you would end up working in the mines for 6 days straight, where they wouldn't even allow you to leave the mine. They would actually lower, kind of food, just enough to kind of keep you going on a rope down into the mine. And as you might imagine, I mean, that would be not just physically imposing, but it would create a lot of psychological duress as well. Human beings probably not really designed to spend a tremendous amount, long periods of time underground, hunched over, very sweltering heat, high humidity, and so forth. Now, of course, not all labor was directed at mining, right? That might have been perceived as perhaps the most valuable kind of economic activity from the point of view of the Spanish crown, but there was also a fair amount of agriculture. And in some ways, it kind of mimicked what we've already talked about with respect to mining, right? So instead of kind of, granting the rights to mine a particular mine and related to that granting a certain amount of Native American labor, in this case, it would be land that was granted by the crown, usually in the form of huge landed estates known as haciendas. And so, they would be privately owned by some very elite, wealthy Spaniard, right? So it's basically the principle of private ownership of large units of land. And we should be clear, right? The only people eligible for, being given, authority over this huge grant of land or mine, for that matter, would have been someone of pure European blood. Either the term they would have used for someone who had been born in Spain, a peninsulare. Peninsulares were whites born in Spain, and if you were someone of pure white blood, European blood born in America, they referred to you as Creoles. And so, really kind of a racial hierarchy already emerging here, where, even there is a division among people of European background, those who are born in Europe seen as superior to those born in the Americas. And then, of course, people of mixed blood coming below that, and then Native Americans at the bottom, and then eventually people of African descent as well at the bottom. As far as the kind of economic activity that took place in the hacienda, it was mostly about producing foodstuffs in order to sustain the other kinds of economic activities, right? So definitely you're providing foodstuffs for the mining areas, also for developing urban centers. And sometimes you might be also involved in the production of leather goods. Again, though, this is a lot of this economic activity directed at mining communities or urban centers in the Americas, not going back to Spain. Now, regarding the labor on the hacienda, you have a system known as debt peonage, right? So what basically happened is, if you're a laborer on the hacienda, right, and you're of Native American background, perhaps mixed blood, but probably Native American, fully Native American, you weren't exactly a slave, but the way this actually played out, you might as well have been, right? So it kind of defined almost a formal servitude, relationship of servitude to the owner. So what often happened is, first of all, you were required to do very intensive labor for long periods of time, but any kind of goods that you needed to purchase, you had to buy from the owners, and very often it would be at exorbitant prices, right? So you ended up buying a lot of things on credit, and in theory, you could basically leave the hacienda, but you would first have to repay the resulting debt, and very often that was pretty much impossible. So it really became impossible for you, for instance, to move to work for new landowners. Maybe you heard that the owner of another hacienda was, much more lenient or much more just, or perhaps providing higher wages and so forth. And fine, in theory, you could leave, but not until you paid the resulting debt. And so again, we see kind of a hierarchy developing societally, but also politically. This kind of is reflected in the way the Spanish crown runs its colonies. Everything is kind of from the top down, right? So you have the crown at the very top, but they basically exercise their authority through something known as the Council of the Indies, right? So this was the actual institution that governed the colonies, but on behalf of and in cooperation with the Spanish monarchy. And they would nominate governors known as viceroys, who would be responsible for managing, they'd be the chief executives on the ground in the New World. And at this point, the Spanish Empire in the New World kind of divided into two main components. You have New Spain, the capital of which was Mexico City, and then you have Peru. So you'd have two viceroys who were the chief executives in the New World, and their basic responsibility was to carry out laws that were created by the Council of the Indies. The viceroys had officials that worked under them. They ruled with what were known as audiencias, or judicial councils, and they also appointed local officers such as the corregidores. These positions would have been reserved for social elites, certainly people of European background, in most cases those coming directly from Europe. And, reminder again that, trade, a very kind of important aspect of the relationship between Spain and the colonies, but remembering that the colonies' chief purpose is to provide, both purposes are to provide raw materials and markets, right? So all of this is kind of, in terms of the economic interaction, is basically under the purview of an institution known as the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, which was based in Seville. And by the way, all goods had to enter Spain from the same point, eventually making their way to Seville. And it was the Casa de Contratación that regulated all trade with the New World in coordination with the Consulado, or Merchant Guild of Seville, and another of other groups involved with American commerce based in Cadiz, right? So the system really designed first and foremost to benefit the monarch, but then there are a number of very privileged merchant groups, and it really is kind of like, a kind of closed club, if you will. And it's, very limited number of privileged merchant groups that are able to benefit from this kind of economic interaction. And by the way, if you visit Seville in Spain today, you might pay a visit to the building that used to house the Casa de Contratación. So a reminder, the most important commodity coming to Spain from the New World would have been bullion, primarily silver, also some gold. And so the Spanish are going to kind of set up a formal kind of network of economic activity. I hesitate to call it trade because today we tend to think of trade as something initiated by those who are actually engaged on the ground. But in any event, setting up kind of a formal form of interaction to ensure that it made it safely to Spain, what was referred to as la flota, right? Essentially a fleet of commercial vessels controlled by the merchants of Seville and escorted by warships in order to, ensure that the gold and silver arrived safely. As you might imagine, the primary concern would have been pirates, many of whom at this time, by the way, are English. And so they would, annually carry, and so this also kind of, provided a means for moving goods and commodities in both directions, right? Annually carrying merchandise from Spain to officially designated ports in America, right, that were allowed to receive these goods, and then it was all very kind of formalized, the manner in which these goods could then be sold. And then after selling their wares, the ships would be loaded up with silver and gold bullion and sail back to Spain, right? So remember, part of this is also kind of ensuring that any kind of economic activity is running between the colonies and Spain, not between colonies, not between the colonies and, say, other European powers. Eventually, in connection with this, a similar arrangement is established between Manila in the Philippines, at some point part of the Spanish Empire, and the Mexican port of Acapulco. Here, the exchange is between, on the one hand, Chinese silk and porcelain, on the other, Mexican silver. But again, right, everything really highly controlled by the Spanish authorities. Trade outside the flota deemed illegal. Regulations exist to prevent Spanish colonists from trading with one another or building their own shipping and commercial industry, right? So even if, there's a bit of, turning a blind eye to a limited amount of smuggling, but, if you don't establish kind of indigenous shipping and kind of, commercial institutions and so forth, it's really not going to get that far off the ground. At this point, I'd like to turn to the Portuguese Empire, which more or less corresponds to Brazil if we're talking about the Americas. And there, things are going to evolve a bit differently, right? So it's not going to be as focused on silver mining, for instance. And from a much earlier point than the Spaniards, the Portuguese are going to begin importing Africans as slaves rather than depending on the Native American population for labor. And, again, probably the most important commodity that's going to be produced during this time is going to be a crop, sugarcane, right, which is the basis of sugar production and does require, by the way, large estates, in this case known as fazendas, and is very labor intensive, hence the large numbers of Africans being imported for slave labor. None of this is to say that there was no mining activity in Brazil, though in Brazil it's going to end up focusing more on gold after they discover deposits of gold. It's a little bit like with the California gold rush. And eventually sugar will be replaced by gold pretty much as kind of the main export, the main commodity being exported from Brazil somewhere around the early 18th century. And some of this has to do with kind of the decline in sugar prices. But again, probably the main impetus was the discovery of deposits in southern Brazil, which led to a gold rush from Europe, and sadly to an increase in slave labor, though this time in the mines. Ultimately, Brazil is going to end up depending much more on slavery, on slave labor, than the Spanish colonies, and will in fact persist in Brazil up until 1888, well past when it comes to an end in the United States. Some of this reflected the fact that Native American labor became increasingly unavailable, either because some of the indigenous tribes had taken refuge in the backcountry, or in other cases had been exterminated. But in any event, right, slavery a much more prominent part of life in Brazil. And related to that, we should note that this reflected to some degree decisions being taken at the local level. Because unlike the Spanish colonies, or certainly to a much greater extent, in Brazil you had a lot more autonomy. More local officials able to serve in the government in Brazil than was the case in the Spanish colonies. We'll come back to the topic of slavery, particularly when we look at the English colonial activity in the Americas. But before we do that, let's look at the French, right? So French colonialism is going to kind of be centered much further north, though also inclusive of parts of the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, you're going to have the islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Dominique, eventually Haiti. But probably more famously, the French are going to heavily colonize the northern part of North America, right? Pretty much what today corresponds to Quebec in Canada, and then kind of coming down the St. Lawrence River. We should note that, right, when we're talking about French colonialism, in terms of the number of Europeans coming over and actually settling in the French colonies, much more similar to what we saw with the Spanish, and to some degree the Portuguese, right? Not really like the English, right? There's going to be a very limited number of French people actually arriving in the Americas. At the forefront are going to be fur traders and Roman Catholic Jesuit missionaries, right? Who again, they're eagerly trying to convert the native peoples that they encounter. But in any event, right, so limited number of Europeans becoming active in the French colonies. French fur traders probably the dominant element. And, both they and the missionaries, apparently saw indigenous peoples as fellow human beings, something evident not just in the attempt to convert them, but the fact that many French fur traders ended up marrying Native American women. Again, very different from what we're going to see in the English case. And just in case we're not clear about what territories we're talking about, we have, these two maps here indicating French colonial territories on the left in the eastern part of what today is Canada, corresponding to the present-day province of Quebec. Many of you probably know that French is one of the official languages there. And then the islands under French control in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe, Martinique. We don't see Haiti here, but that would have been part of the French colonial empire in the Caribbean as well. But now looking at English colonialism, and of course as Americans, residents, citizens of these United States, this might be, some of this history might be a bit familiar. So English colonialism, when we talked about the Spanish and Portuguese, it's pretty easy to kind of summarize the main impetus behind Spanish Portuguese colonialism, economically driven, a lot of it connected to the mining and so forth. English were actually hoping to find silver and gold mines in North America, but they came up empty. But in the end, they found other sources of wealth, primarily related to agriculture, though also lumber. But if we're going to summarize like the main impetuses for English colonialism, we might break it down into three main factors. On the one hand, some of it directly related to a desire to attain wealth, but this is really at a much more individual level. It's not so much about the English crown, but about individual Englishmen who decided to, see if they could make their fortune in the New World, either through farming or trade. In some cases, vast land tracts were awarded to royal favorites, and those became the foundations of specific colonies, eventually individual states that make up the United States. And then a third factor that is in some ways very unique to English colonialism in North America, those who were seeking religious freedom, right, who were being persecuted back home and decided that they could, kind of find a space for themselves in the New World where, truth be told, they would be the top dog and could persecute others. I'm only being somewhat facetious in putting it that way. We might note there was one specific case, the case of the colony of Georgia, actually awarded to someone who was trying to implement criminal justice reform, if you will, a fellow named James Oglethorpe, who would turn it into a refuge for English debtors, people who owed money and were trying to avoid going to jail. When we learn about American history, of course, we tend to focus on this idea of Europeans coming here in search of religious freedom, right? The pursuit of religious liberty. In most cases, we're talking about Protestants. Probably the most famous example would be the Puritans who landed in Plymouth Rock in what would become Massachusetts, often referred to as Pilgrims. But we have a few other examples, like the Baptist Roger Williams, who would establish the colony of Rhode Island. In some cases, in his case, to escape persecution from the Puritans, right? So kind of, 2 degrees of separation from England. And then we have, of course, the Quaker William Penn, who was awarded a huge tract of land in what would become Pennsylvania. The one non-Protestant example might be Maryland, right? So this corresponds to Queen Mary, often known as Bloody Mary. And you might recall she had tried to bring Catholicism back to England. And so the colony would be initiated by the Roman Catholic Lord Baltimore at the time that she was sitting on the throne. So in theory, designed to be a refuge for Catholics. And of course, later on, as England and then later on the United Kingdom become much more Protestant, such that Catholics are to some degree being persecuted, we might imagine some of them might have taken it upon themselves to go to Maryland. So mostly Protestantism, but here we need to make a distinction between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, right? The southern states will end up being dominated by the sanctioned official Protestant Church of England, the Anglican Church. So in most cases, not arriving in the New World to escape religious persecution, but rather to attain wealth. At some point, available land running out in England, so you might decide to go to the New World. Either because you already have some wealth that you might use as a basis for getting started, or you might come as an indentured servant, and then after you've put in your time, try to gain some land for yourself, right? But you're not going there to escape religious persecution. In fact, you're kind of, maintaining the officially sanctioned Church of England back home there. Here we see an image of an Anglican church in Virginia. New England is going to be very different, right? There, we're mostly talking about Protestant sects associated with Calvinism. So they didn't call themselves Calvinists per se, but for instance, again, the Puritans coming from England would have been the obvious example, but also Baptists and Quakers. And in the case of New England, in part because they were trying to get away from England, they would very quickly set up self-governing institutions, right, where they could kind of run their own community to some degree on the basis of their religious beliefs. But what's really important here is, from a pretty early point, kind of developing traditions and institutions of self-government and a healthy suspicion of central authority, right? Particularly potentially despotic monarchs who, they were always living somewhat in fear of, right? Like what would happen if, okay, we're over here in the English colony of Massachusetts, but what happens if the monarch back in England turns out to be despotic, eliminates the parliament, and tries to reimpose Catholicism? At some point he might try to do the same thing there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the attitude of English colonists very different from that of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French, all of whom are predominantly Catholic. Protestants had very little interest in evangelizing the locals, of converting them to the Christian faith, partly because they tended to see them as subhuman. So even debating about whether they actually had souls or not. And obviously from our modern day perspective, this is kind of horrifying, right? But I mean, that was the mentality at the time. Sadly, I would argue that it has continued to inform how at least some people view Native Americans. And for the most part, they saw Native Americans as people to be gotten out of the way, right? So that they could basically acquire their land. Disease, of course, would play a big role in eliminating a fair number of Native Americans, but a lot of it was through direct conflict. Right, one tribe that is a really good example of how the two things in tandem, disease and conflict, could pretty much wipe out an entire tribe would be the Pequot tribe in present-day Connecticut, which were almost completely eliminated between 1634 and 1638, like within the space of 4 years. And then the small number who remained alive were sold into slavery, right, effectively eliminating the tribe altogether. Sometimes Native Americans would fight back. Probably the best example of that would be a tribal chief, Mendicant, who went by the name King Philip. And so, at some point he brought the war to the English settlers rather than just sitting back and waiting for it to be thrusted upon them. Ended up killing large numbers of English settlers, but at the end of the day, particularly as more and more settlers arrived from England, and at some point they have the support of the English crown. Really, this doesn't amount to much more than a holding action, right? I mean, they're able to temporarily slow down the English settlers, but in the end, the numbers are going to overwhelm. Probably the most formidable Native Americans that the English encountered were the Iroquois. So they broke down into 5 tribes, but they were highly cooperative with one another, had formed effectively a confederation known as the Iroquois Nation. They were based roughly in what corresponds to New York State. And they were also very savvy. So, I mean, they were formidable because they were actually quite powerful in certain ways, but they were also very clever in the sense of, kind of reading the circumstances at any given time and allowing that to determine what strategy they employed, sometimes aligning with the English settlers, sometimes fighting against them, very often when fighting with them against other Indian tribes, later against the French. Again, though, it didn't really alter the kind of more long-term pattern, which is simply that as you had more and more Europeans arriving to settle within these colonies, this just kept forcing the Native Americans to move further and further inland as their territories were claimed. In any event, we're going to stop the first half of this lecture there. The second half is actually pretty short. We'll be talking a bit about the Columbian Exchange and then elaborating a bit on the institution of slavery. But in any event, this is the end of the first part, and hopefully see you in a bit.